The dust of Wyoming was a language Lila Ashford knew by heart. She could read its color. In spring, it was a dark, promising brown, rich with melted snow. In summer, a fine, pale tan that coated everything in a layer of heat. But now, in the fall of 1890, it was a hard, angry red. It rose in bitter clouds from beneath the hooves of her mare, a constant reminder of the thirst that was settling deep into the bones of the land at the edge of the Bighorn Mountains. From her vantage point on the low ridge overlooking the Ashford Ranch, the world was painted in shades of rust and gold. The cottonwoods along the creek bed were a blaze of yellow, but their leaves sounded brittle, rattling in the wind like old paper. The creek itself, the lifeblood of her operation, was a shadow of its former self, a silver thread where a thick ribbon should have been. 3 months. It had been 3 months since her father, Sterling Ashford, had been laid to rest in the family plot behind the main house, and in that time, the sky had remained stubbornly, cruelly blue. Lila, at 28, was considered an anomaly in the territory, an unmarried woman in charge of a spread as large as the Ashford Ranch, not to mention the small but productive silver claim tucked into the foothills, was enough to set tongues wagging from Redwater to Cheyenne. She had her father's sharp mind for business and his stubborn chin, but she lacked the simple advantage of being a man. Every decision was questioned, every order second-guessed by men who had worked for her father for 20 years. They looked at her and saw a temporary inconvenience, a problem that marriage would eventually solve. She pulled a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of her riding jacket. The wind snatched at it, trying to tear it from her grasp. It was the latest letter from the lawyers in Cheyenne, a crisp, formal summary of the clause she now knew by heart, a poison pill left by a loving but misguided father. Sterling, in his patriarchal wisdom, had believed his daughter needed a protector, and so, the will stipulated that she must be married legally and bindingly within 30 days prior to the final reading. If she failed, the entire estate, the ranch, the mine, the house she was born in would pass to the next male heir, her cousin, Silas Carr. The name left a taste like bile in her mouth. Silas, a man whose hands had never known a callous, whose wealth grew not from the land but from the ink of contracts and the cold steel of railroad tracks. He was a banker, a tycoon, a creature of the city who saw the Wyoming wilderness not as a home, but as a resource to be carved up and sold. He had visited once, years ago, his polished city boots looking ridiculous in the red dust, his eyes sweeping over the land with a predator's appraisal. 30 days. The reading was scheduled for the end of November. The clock was ticking. Each sunset a turn of a screw tightening around her throat. Down in the valley, the town of Redwater huddled along the main thoroughfare. Its name was no poetry. The dust was simply that red. From this distance, it was a collection of miniature blocks, the broad roof of the livery, the impossibly thin steeple of the Aspen Wood Church where Reverend Ezekiel Ward preached to a flock of ranchers, miners, and weary townsfolk, and the squat, solid shape of the halter, the saloon where most of Redwater's real business was conducted. There was also a small, unassuming building with a single star painted on the door, the office of Sheriff Maeve Doolin, an Irishwoman with a will as unbending as a branding iron and a gaze that missed nothing. Sheriff Doolin was perhaps the only person in town who treated Lila not as an heiress or a spinster, but simply as a landowner with problems. And her biggest problem, besides the looming deadline of the will, was water. The canal that fed her pastures, an artery her father had spent a fortune to build, was now a source of simmering conflict. With the drought, other ranchers were growing desperate. Their herds were thinning, their own creeks drying to a trickle. They looked at her canal, still carrying a steady flow from the higher mountain springs, with covetous eyes. Twice in the last month, someone had tried to divert the flow, small acts of sabotage that were impossible to prove. Lila folded the letter and tucked it away. There was no solution to be found in staring at the dry earth. She nudged her mare, Juniper, into a slow walk down the ridge, her destination the town she both relied on and resented. The whispers started the moment she rode onto Main Street. They were like the dry leaves, rustling in doorways and behind curtained windows. She had learned to ignore them, to fix her gaze straight ahead, her back ramrod straight. She was Lila Ashford, mistress of the finest ranch in the county. But inside, the whispers coiled. Asterisk Ice Queen asterisk. They called her too proud. Thinks she's better than any man here. She knew the source of the rumors. They flowed from the same well of resentment as the water dispute, fanned by the subtle influence of Silas Carr's money, which had a way of loosening tongues in the saloon. She dismounted in front of the general store, the leather of her saddle creaking a familiar protest. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave her a tight-lipped nod as she entered, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. "Morning, Miss Ashford," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Mr. Henderson, I need a sack of flour and a box of .44 cartridges." His eyebrows twitched, expecting trouble. "Expecting winter," she replied coolly, her voice betraying none of the tension gripping her. As he weighed the flour, a notice posted near the counter caught her eye. It was from the bank, a formal announcement regarding water rights and delinquent loans, signed by the manager, a man everyone knew was firmly in Silas Carr's pocket. The message was clear. Though written in dense legalese, any outstanding debts related to infrastructure like a certain canal, for instance, would be called in. It was another turn of the screw. Silas wasn't just waiting for the will's deadline. He was actively squeezing her, trying to break her before the final blow. Lila paid for her goods, her movements stiff. She could feel the weight of unspoken judgments in the room. They saw a rich woman buying ammunition and assumed she was preparing to defend her hoard against her starving neighbors. They didn't see the wolf at her own door, the one dressed in a fine suit and holding a pen instead of a pistol. Her next stop was the sheriff's office. Maeve Doolin was sitting behind her desk, a mountain of paperwork before her. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face a map of sun and worry, her red hair pinned in a severe bun. She looked up as Lila entered, her expression one of weary sympathy. "Lila, don't tell me someone's tried to dam your canal again." "Not yet today," Lila said, setting her parcel on the corner of the desk. "But the bank has posted a new notice. Silas is making his move on the canal loan." Maeve sighed, running a hand over her face. "I saw it. It's legal. Lila, ugly as a sin, but legal. His bank holds the note. With the drought declared an emergency, he can argue that the water is a public resource being hoarded by a private interest with a delinquent account. It's not delinquent. The payment isn't due for another 2 weeks." "He'll find a way," Maeve said, her voice grim. "A forgotten fee, a misfiled paper. When a man like Carr wants something, the law can be a flexible tool. What you need is not a sheriff, but a husband." The words were blunt, but not unkind. It was the simple, brutal truth of her situation. Lila's jaw tightened. "I'm aware." "Any prospects?" Maeve asked, her gaze softening slightly. Lila gave a short, bitter laugh. "Every single man in a 50-mile radius who has proposed in the last 3 months. All of them more interested in my silver mine than my dowry. I'd be signing away my freedom for a different kind of cage." "There has to be someone," Maeve insisted. Lila shook her head, a sense of hopelessness washing over her. She thanked the sheriff and left, the weight of her predicament heavier than before. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine from the high country. The high country. The thought brought an image to her mind, unbidden. A man spoken of in whispers of a different kind, not of wealth or power, but of something wilder. Jonah Pike, the man who lived alone on the slopes of Cloud Peak. They called him a mountain man, a hermit. He had served as a scout for the cavalry, they said, until the horrors he'd seen drove him from the world of men. He lived by hunting and trapping, only coming down to Redwater a few times a year for salt, coffee, and ammunition, his face a mask of quiet reserve. He spoke little, his eyes a startling gray that seemed to look right through a person. He'd lost his family. The story went, a wife and child taken by diphtheria back in Kansas. He had come to the mountains to bury himself, to escape the ghosts that haunted the flatlands. He was a figure of myth as much as a man, a ghost in his own right. But Lila remembered something else. Her father had hired him once, years ago, to guide a geologist through the treacherous high passes. Sterling had spoken of him with a rare, quiet respect. Jonah Pike, he'd said, is a man who knows the value of things you can't put a price on. He's true. The thought was a flicker of light in a vast darkness, a foolish, desperate thought. What would a man who had intentionally fled society want with her troubles? What could she possibly offer him? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't see the scene unfolding in the deep shadows of the alley between the saloon and the livery stable. It was the flicker of a match that caught her eye. Two men, their faces briefly illuminated. One was Martin Brewer, the clerk from Silas's bank, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin. The other was a stranger. He was tall and lean, with a long duster that did little to hide the well-worn holster strapped to his hip. He had the hard, empty eyes of a man who sold his gun to the highest bidder. Lila instinctively pulled Juniper back into the shadows of the blacksmith's forge, her heart pounding against her ribs. She watched as Brewer spoke in a low, urgent tone, his head bobbing nervously. He passed a thick envelope to the stranger. The gunslinger took it, weighed it in his hand, and gave a slow, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. He tucked the envelope inside his coat, nodded once, and melted back into the deeper darkness of the alley. Brewer scurried away, back toward the main street, looking for all the world like a rat fleeing a trap. The air in Lila's lungs turned to ice. This was no longer about legal papers and bank notices. Silas was done squeezing. He was preparing to break her. The hired gun wasn't for a lawsuit. He was for a foreclosure of a different, more permanent kind. He was insurance, in a lawless territory. A tragic accident befalling a lone woman could solve a lot of problems for a man like Silas Carr. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her despair. But beneath it, something else ignited, a hot, defiant anger. She would not be scared off her land. She would not be another woman erased by a man's greed. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, a man who knows the value of things you can't put a price on. In that moment, her decision was made. It was not a plan. It was a prayer, a desperate gamble thrown into the teeth of the wind. The whispers of the town, the legal traps, the threat lurking in the shadows, they all faded before the clarity of this one. Wild hope. She would not look for a husband in Redwater, a town where every man looked at her and saw an opportunity, a shortcut to wealth. She would look for a man who wanted nothing, who had already lost everything. Lila Ashford swung herself back into the saddle, her movements sure and decisive. She did not turn Juniper's head back toward the sprawling comfort of the Ashford ranch. Instead, she turned her toward the darkening silhouette of the Bighorn Mountains, toward the cold, lonely slopes of Cloud Peak. She was going to find Jonah Pike. He was the only man in Wyoming who would not look at her and see dollar signs. She had to pray he would see a woman worth saving. The lights of Redwater vanished behind the first fold of the hills, swallowed by an ocean of darkness. With them went the last vestiges of the world Lila Ashford understood. Up here, the currency of land deeds and banknotes was worthless. The air itself was different, thinner, colder, and scented with the sharp, honest perfume of pine and damp earth. Juniper's hooves struck stone, the sound ringing out in a profound silence, broken only by the rising wind that moaned through the high passes like a restless spirit. The trail her father had described was more memory than path, a faint scar on the land that only a skilled tracker would follow. For 6 hours, she climbed. The journey was a systematic stripping away of her identity. She was no longer the mistress of the Ashford Ranch. She was a solitary woman pushing a weary horse up a mountain. The sun, when it rose, did not warm her. It was a distant, cold disk that poured a pale, honey-colored light onto the granite faces of the peaks, making the world look stark and beautiful and unforgiving. She passed through groves of aspen whose white trunks stood like silent sentinels, their last golden leaves trembling in the wind. The trail narrowed, forcing them to hug a sheer rock face with a dizzying drop to one side. She saw the delicate, cloven tracks of bighorn sheep and, once, a set of prints that made the hair on her arms stand up. They were huge, clawed, and unnervingly fresh. A black bear, and a large one. She spurred Juniper onward, her hand resting briefly on the butt of the rifle in her scabbard. An early snow began to fall, not a gentle blanket but hard, stinging pellets driven by a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. It found every gap in her clothing, chilling her to the bone. Doubt, a cold and creeping thing, began to seep into her resolve. What was she doing? Chasing a ghost, a legend, on the word of a dead man. This was a fool's errand, born of desperation. She was about to turn back when she smelled the faint, welcome scent of wood smoke. Hope surged through her, warming her more than her heavy coat. She rounded a massive boulder, and there it was, tucked into a small, sheltered meadow. The cabin was not the crude lean-to she might have expected. It was built of thick, expertly notched logs, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true. It was a small fortress against the wilderness, solid and self-reliant. Smoke curled from the chimney, a gray plume against the darkening sky. As she dismounted, her legs stiff and trembling from the long ride, the cabin door opened. The man who emerged was not the wild, half-mad creature of town gossip. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a quiet economy that spoke of immense strength held in reserve. His dark hair was long, brushing his collar, and his beard was thick but neatly trimmed. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a clear, startling gray, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness, taking in her expensive riding gear, her exhausted horse, and the desperation she was sure was written all over her face. He held a rifle cradled in his arms, his posture relaxed but ready. "That's far enough, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse. "Mr. Pike," she asked, her own voice sounding thin in the vast emptiness. "Jonah Pike." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Most people have better sense than to come up here, especially with a storm blowing in." "State your business." "My name is Lila Ashford. My father was Sterling Ashford. He spoke of you." A flicker of something recognition. Perhaps memory passed through his eyes, but his expression remained unchanged. He gestured with his head toward the small corral next to the cabin. "Your horse is spent. Put her in there. There's shelter and water. Then you can come inside." It was not an invitation. It was a command. Lila did as she was told, her hands fumbling with the saddle cinch, her fingers numb with cold. When she finally stepped inside the cabin, the warmth from the hearth washed over her, and she had to fight a wave of dizziness. The interior was like the man himself, spare, functional, and meticulously ordered. There were no decorations, no comforts for comfort's sake. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bunk was built against one wall. Polished tools hung in neat rows. Everything was clean, from the swept plank floor to the soot-blackened kettle hanging over the fire. It was the home of a man who had pared his life down to the barest essentials. And yet, her eyes were drawn to one object that didn't belong. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece, next to a block of ammunition and a whetstone, sat a small brass bell. It was tarnished with age and had a noticeable chip in its rim. A small, crescent-shaped flaw. It was a delicate, almost whimsical thing to find in such a starkly masculine space, a piece of a forgotten world. Jonah placed 2 tin mugs on the table and filled them with steaming black coffee from the kettle. He pushed one toward her. "Drink. You look half frozen." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, the heat a painful blessing on her frozen fingers. She took a sip. It was strong and bitter. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. "Now," he said, his gray eyes fixed on her, "why is Sterling Ashford's daughter on my mountain?" This was it. The moment she had rehearsed and discarded 100 times on the ride up. Her carefully prepared speech about needing a bodyguard, a representative, now felt flimsy and absurd. She decided to circle the truth, to test the waters first. "I'm in some trouble, Mr. Pike. A business matter. I need to hire someone. Someone who isn't on anyone's payroll in Redwater. Someone who knows how to handle himself." "I'm not for hire," he said flatly. "Everyone's for hire," she countered, a touch of her usual authority returning. "I can pay you well, more than you'd make in a year from trapping." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it held no humor. "Ma'am, you seem to be under the impression that I need money." He gestured around the cabin. "My needs are met. What I value is my privacy, the one thing people from the valley can't seem to understand." He was shutting her down, polite but firm. Lila's desperation made her push harder. "It involves my ranch, a dispute over my father's will. There are powerful interests at play. Men who don't play by the rules." She thought of the hired gun in the alley. The cold smile. "I need protection. I need a show of force. A man standing with me who can't be bought or bullied." Jonah leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. He was listening, but she could feel the wall around him, 1,000 feet high. She saw the conflict in the subtle tightening of his jaw. This was a man who had run from the world's troubles, and here she was, dragging them right to his doorstep. He knew what this would mean. Riding into Redwater as Lila Ashford's hired man would make him a target of gossip, speculation, and whatever else Silas Carr could throw at him. He would be pulled back into the very society he had fought so hard to escape. For a man hiding from his ghosts, the last thing he wanted was to take on someone else's. "A rich woman's troubles," he said, the words quiet but sharp. "You'll forgive me if I find it hard to sympathize. There are people in that valley who are wondering how they'll feed their children this winter. Your problem is you might lose some money. Theirs is a different kind of poverty." The accusation stung, steeped in the very prejudice she fought against every day. "You think this is about money," she flared. "This is about my home, my father's legacy. It's about being driven off my land by a man who would see it all burn if it meant a bigger number in his ledger." He didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. He was thinking of his own losses. She realized. His own home, his own legacy, lost to the random cruelty of disease. To him, her fight must seem like a privilege. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer. "The storm is getting worse. You can't ride back down in this. You can take the bunk for the night. We'll talk in the morning." It was a dismissal. He was not saying no, but he had not said yes. He was retreating back into his silence, his solitude, defeated. Lila nodded. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind numb. She felt trapped, not just in the cabin by the storm, but by the impossible predicament of her life. Hours later, the storm was raging, a wild symphony of shrieking wind and sleet lashing against the windows. Lila lay on the narrow bunk, a rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin. But she couldn't sleep. She watched Jonah sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical, practiced movements. He was a man completely at home in his isolation, a part of the wildness outside. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm's howl, a frantic, desperate shouting, followed by the pounding of a fist on the cabin door. Jonah was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, his movements fluid and silent. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low command. "It's me, Finn, from the Ashford Ranch," a young voice cried, choked with panic. "I have to see Miss Ashford. It's urgent." Lila was off the bunk, her heart seizing with dread. Jonah unbarred the door, and a young man stumbled in, covered in snow, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. It was Finn O'Connell, her youngest and most loyal ranch hand. "Finn, what is it? What's happened?" she demanded, rushing to his side. He gasped for breath, his eyes wide and wild. "It's the dam. Miss, the main dam on the north pasture. Someone blew it up tonight, used blasting powder. The water, it's all gone, just draining out into the dry flats. By morning, the reservoir will be empty." The words hit Lila like a physical blow. The canal, the reservoir, the only reason her cattle were still healthy while others starved. Without that water, with winter coming on, her herd was a dead thing. They would die of thirst in a matter of weeks. Silas hadn't just hired a gunman for intimidation. He had acted. He had severed her ranch's lifeline. Finn looked at her, his expression wretched. "We're ruined, aren't we?" Lila stood frozen, the warmth of the cabin turning to ice in her veins. She looked past Finn to Jonah. His face was a thundercloud, the quiet reserve shattered by a cold, hard anger. He was no longer a hermit contemplating his solitude. He was a former cavalry scout looking at an enemy's flanking maneuver. After Finn had rested and taken a horse from Jonah's corral to ride back, a heavy silence descended on the cabin once more. But this silence was different. The game had changed. Her plea for a bodyguard was now pitifully inadequate. Protection wouldn't bring back the water. A show of force wouldn't save her cattle. She stared into the dancing flames of the fire, her last shreds of pride burning away, leaving only the cold, hard core of her desperation. She had come to the mountain to negotiate, but there was nothing left to negotiate with. There was only one thing she could ask for. One insane, impossible gambit that could give her the legal standing to fight back. Tomorrow morning, she would not ask Jonah Pike to be her protector. She would ask him to be her husband. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and achingly cold. A fragile light crept over the eastern peaks, illuminating a landscape draped in a thin, pristine blanket of snow. Every pine needle was frosted in silver, and the air was so crisp it hurt to breathe. Lila stood on the small porch of the cabin, her breath pluming in a white cloud before her. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night listening to the wind and the steady sound of Jonah's breathing from his spot by the hearth, the chaos of her thoughts slowly settling into a single, terrifying point of clarity. Jonah emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He moved with the silence that was his nature, a part of the mountain itself. He handed one to her, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of warmth in the frozen air. He didn't speak, just leaned against a porch post, his gray eyes scanning the valley below as if reading a map. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the vast silence. Her carefully constructed walls of pride and propriety had been washed away by the events of the last day. All that was left was the raw, unvarnished truth of her situation. She turned to face him, her own gaze as direct and unflinching as she could make it. The time for circling the truth was over. "Will you be my husband for one day?" The words hung in the frigid air between them, stark and unbelievable. Jonah's stoic expression finally broke. A flicker of profound shock, then disbelief, crossed his features. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as if to see if she was serious. "What did you say?" His voice was a low rasp. "You heard me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She took a deep breath, the cold air searing her lungs. "Last night proved that hiring a guard isn't enough. Silas won't stop. He destroyed my dam. He'll destroy my ranch, my people, everything my father built. but he can't touch it if I'm married. The will is specific. If I am legally wed before the final reading, he has no claim. The estate passes to me and my husband." She saw the immediate refusal forming in his eyes and hurried on, laying out the desperate architecture of her plan. It would be a contract, a business arrangement. "We ride down to Redwater today. We get the license, have the sheriff officiate. We sign the papers. You fulfill the terms of my father's will. Tomorrow, or the day after, whenever you wish. We have it annulled. I'll sign any document you want, stating it was a marriage in name only. You'll be free. I'll pay you, of course, handsomely. Enough so that you'll never have to see another soul for the rest of your life. If that's what you want." She finished, her chest tight, the proposition laid bare in all its transactional ugliness. She was asking him to sell his name, to pawn his solitude, to shield her from a world he had abandoned. Jonah was silent for a long time. He turned his back to her and stared out at the mountains, a formidable, unreadable silhouette against the rising sun. She could see the war within him. Every line of his posture screamed his desire to refuse, to send her and her valley problems packing, to retreat back into the quiet dignity of his isolation. He had come here to escape complication, and she was a walking, talking embodiment of it, a rich woman's problem, he had called it, and now she was asking him to bind himself to it, even for a day. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was one she couldn't decipher. The shock was gone, replaced by a deep, weary gravity. He looked at her not as an heiress, but as a soldier might look at another on the eve of a battle they were sure to lose. "I won't take your money," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Her heart sank. It was a refusal. Of course it was. "But I'll do it," he added. Lila blinked, certain she had misheard. "You will." "On one condition," he said, taking a step closer. The intensity in his gaze pinned her in place. "If I do this, I do it my way. There will be no talk of annulment tomorrow. There will be no pretense. For as long as it takes to see this through, we are husband and wife. Not in name, but in fact, in front of the law, and in front of every soul in that town. You are my wife. That means I protect what's mine. Your ranch, your name, your safety. They become my responsibility. I will stand with you, and I will act as a husband should. I will defend you against Silas Carr, his lawyers, his hired guns, and the wagging tongues of every gossip in Redwater. We do this for real, or we don't do it at all." It was a shocking decision, an astonishing counteroffer. He wasn't agreeing to a simple transaction. He was enlisting. He was setting terms not of finance, but of honor. He was a man who had lost a family, who had walled his heart away in stone, and yet his first instinct upon re-entering the world was not to exploit the situation, but to establish a code of conduct, a bastion of integrity in the middle of her desperate sham. He was offering her not a loophole, but a shield. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sudden, for the first time in months. She did not feel utterly alone. She swallowed hard and gave a single, decisive nod. Agreed. The ride down the mountain was a descent into a different world. The silence between them was no longer awkward or tense, but charged with a new, unspoken understanding. They were partners in a conspiracy, allies in a war that had not yet been declared. The red dust of the valley floor rose up to meet them, a stark contrast to the clean snow of the high country. As they rode onto Main Street, Redwater reacted as they knew it would. Windows flew open. Men stopped mid-conversation in front of the saloon. A wave of whispers followed them like their own dust cloud. Lila Ashford, the Ice Queen, riding into town with the wild mountain man from Cloud Peak. The sight was scandalous, baffling, and utterly riveting. Lila kept her chin high, her back straight. But she was intensely aware of Jonah beside her. He seemed oblivious to the stairs, his gaze sweeping the street with a scout's practiced vigilance, missing nothing. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Maeve Doolin looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in disbelief as they entered. She took in Lila's determined expression and Jonah's formidable presence, and a look of profound exasperation crossed her face. "Saints preserve us," she muttered, putting down her pen. "Lila, what in the name of heaven is this?" "This is Mr. Jonah Pike," Lila said, her voice clear and calm, "and we're here for a marriage license." Maeve stared from one to the other, her mouth slightly agape. You've lost your mind, both of you. This is what you came up with, marrying the town hermit. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "I know exactly how it looks," Lila said. "It looks like I am meeting the terms of my father's will, and it looks like my ranch now has a protector that Silas Carr can't intimidate." "He'll challenge it in a heartbeat," Maeve shot back. "He'll call it a fraud, and any judge in this territory will be inclined to agree with him." "Let him," Jonah spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble that seemed to make the very floorboards vibrate. "But as of today, she won't be facing him alone. Sheriff, we need the license, and you're going to officiate. We need it done today." Maeve looked into his steady gray eyes and saw the same unbending will she saw in her own mirror each morning. She sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of surrender. "I need 2 witnesses." "I have them in mind," Lila said. "Reverend Ezekiel Ward and Mrs. Ruth Navarro." The choice was strategic. The Reverend was a man of unimpeachable moral character, a pillar of the community whose word carried immense weight. Ruth Navarro, the young widowed schoolteacher, was beloved by the town for her kindness and gentle spirit. Neither of them could be accused of being party to a greedy scheme. They were the heart of Redwater, its conscience. The small, hastily arranged ceremony took place an hour later in the sheriff's office. The room felt crowded with just the 5 of them. Reverend Ward, a tall, dignified man with silvering hair, stood beside Ruth, who clutched a small book to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of concern and support. Maeve read the short, legal text in a clipped, reluctant monotone. Lila's hands were trembling as she held them clasped in front of her. When it came time for the vows, she looked at Jonah. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of his own past was visible in his eyes, the memory of another vow, made in another lifetime. But he spoke the words clearly and firmly. "I do." When it was her turn, Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "I do." As Jonah slid a simple, thin gold band onto her finger, a ring he had produced from a small leather pouch. A ring she dared not ask, the history of the door to the office was thrown open. Silas Carr stood there, his face a mask of incandescent fury. He was flanked by his lawyer, a man with a face like a weasel, and 2 other men, including the hired gun Lila had seen in the alley. "Stop this mockery," Silas boomed, his voice echoing in the small space. "Sheriff, you are party to a blatant fraud. This is a sham marriage, a desperate, transparent attempt to circumvent the clear intentions of my uncle's last will and testament." His lawyer stepped forward, waving a sheaf of papers. "We are filing an immediate injunction to contest the validity of this union. We will prove in a court of law that this is nothing more than a financial transaction, a conspiracy to commit fraud." Maeve stepped between them, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. "You're too late, Silas. The certificate is signed. They're legally wed. You can file whatever you like. But as of this moment, this is Mr. and Mrs. Pike." The name sounded foreign, jarring. Asterisk Mrs. Pike. Silas's eyes, cold and reptilian, fixed on Jonah. "And you," he sneered, "the savage from the mountains. I don't know what she paid you, but I'll double it. Walk away now, and you might just live to enjoy it." Jonah didn't rise to the bait. He simply stood beside Lila, a silent, immovable wall of granite. His stillness seemed to infuriate Silas more than any threat could have. Fuming, Silas and his entourage stormed out, their threats to see them in court hanging in the air. The warmth and quiet dignity of the moment had been shattered. Reverend Ward placed a calming hand on Lila's arm. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Child, have faith." Ruth gave her a quick, supportive hug. "We're with you, Lila. Don't you mind them." But as Lila and Jonah stepped out onto the dusty street, the tension was palpable. The town was watching. Silas and his men were standing by the saloon, their expressions menacing. The hired gun, a man named Harker, deliberately stepped into their path. "Well, well," Harker drawled, his hand hovering near his gun. "Look at the happy couple. The mountain man's come down to Playhouse. I wonder how tough you really are when you ain't hiding behind rocks and trees." It was a blatant provocation, designed to start a fight, to paint Jonah as a violent brute in front of the whole town. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Jonah stopped. He looked not at Harker, but at the man's gun hand. "You have two choices," Jonah said, his voice dangerously soft. "You can step aside, or you can find out." Harker smirked, his ego getting the better of him. "I think I'll take my chances." His hand moved, but he never had a chance. In a blur of motion that was too fast to follow, Jonah closed the distance. One hand shot out, grabbing Harker's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it at an unnatural angle. Harker cried out in pain. With his other hand, Jonah smoothly lifted the pistol from its holster, checked the chamber, and then tucked it into his own belt. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. It was not a brawl. It was a professional, silent, and utterly humiliating disarmament. Jonah released the man's wrist and stepped back. Standing once again at Lila's side, he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a punch. He had simply taken control. Harker stood there, clutching his wrist, his face a mixture of agony and disbelief. Silas's face was pale with rage. A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. This was not the simple-minded hermit of their stories. This was something else entirely. The rumor began to spread like wildfire, from the saloon to the general store. Whispered over fences and across porches, the mountain man wasn't just wild, he was dangerous, and he was Lila Ashford's husband. The dust from their brief, explosive wedding had barely settled before Silas Carr's retaliation came. It arrived not with the roar of a shotgun, but with the quiet, devastating finality of the law. Sheriff Maeve Doolin met them as they were leaving the general store, her face grim. "A rider just came in from Cheyenne," she said, her voice low. "A circuit judge's clerk. Silas filed his petition less than an hour after you signed that certificate. He's suing on the grounds of fraudulent nuptials for the purpose of material gain." Lila felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the increasingly sharp wind. "He can do that." "He can, and he has," Maeve confirmed. "The judge has placed a temporary injunction on all Ashford assets, specifically the deed transfer for the silver mine. He's freezing everything until a preliminary hearing can be held to determine if the marriage has merit." "A hearing?" Jonah's voice was a low growl. "When?" Maeve looked at them, her expression full of pity. 72 hours, right here in Redwater. The judge is riding in himself. He wants to look you both in the eye." 72 hours. A 3-day siege. Silas wasn't just challenging their marriage. He was putting it on trial in front of the entire town. He would parade their arrangement, strip it of its context, and paint Lila as a manipulative schemer and Jonah as a hired fool. The humiliation would be as much a part of the punishment as the legal defeat. As if on cue, the sky, which had been a bruised purple all afternoon, began to release its burden. Fat, wet snowflakes, the vanguard of a true blizzard, began to fall, melting on the red dust and turning it to a dark, bloody mud. The wind picked up, howling down Main Street, rattling windows and tearing at the signs. "You need to get back to your ranch," Maeve said to Lila, pulling her collar tight. "Batten down. This is going to be a bad one." Lila nodded, her mind reeling. She and Jonah walked in silence to retrieve their horses from the livery. The stable boy looked at them with wide, curious eyes. The entire town was a tinderbox of gossip, and they were the spark. As Lila swung into her saddle, a sudden, vicious gust of wind tore through the stable yard. Juniper shied violently, and the reins, slick with melting snow, were ripped through Lila's grasp. She cried out as a sharp, burning pain lanced across her palm, the rough leather slicing the skin. Jonah was there in an instant, his hand on Juniper's bridle, his voice a low, calming murmur that settled the panicked animal. He looked at Lila's hand. She opened her palm to reveal a deep, bleeding cut. "We need to get that cleaned and wrapped," he said, his voice clipped and professional. He glanced at the sky. The snow was a blinding, swirling curtain now, the world beyond the edge of town completely erased. They rode out, heading for the Ashford Ranch, but they hadn't gone half a mile before it became clear it was a fool's errand. The trail was disappearing. The wind was a physical force, pushing against them, and the cold was sinking its teeth deep into their flesh. They were riding blind into a white, roaring hell. Jonah pulled his horse to a stop, so close she could see the snowflakes clinging to his beard. "We can't make it," he shouted over the wind. "We'll be lost in 10 minutes. We have to turn back." Turn back where she cried, her hand throbbing in time with her frantic heartbeat. "We can't stay in town." The thought of spending her wedding night in a room at the Redwater Hotel, under the gleeful, watchful eyes of Silas and his cronies, was unbearable. "Not the town," Jonah said, his decision already made. "My cabin. It's closer, and it's built to survive this." There was no other choice. To continue on was to risk their lives. They turned their horses, battling the wind, and began the slow, arduous climb back up the mountain trail, a path that was now an enemy. The journey that had taken Lila 6 hours in the clear now felt like an eternity. The storm was a wild beast, trying to throw them from the narrow path. Lila's world shrank to the sight of Jonah's broad back, a dark, solid shape in the swirling chaos, the only fixed point in a world gone mad. When they finally reached the sheltered meadow, the cabin was a beacon of salvation. Inside, the storm's fury was reduced to a muffled howl. Jonah moved with purpose, stoking the fire until it roared to life, filling the small space with flickering light and blessed warmth. Lila sank onto a chair, shivering uncontrollably, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settling over her. Jonah came to her with a basin of hot water and clean cloths. He knelt before her, taking her injured hand gently in his. His touch was surprisingly careful, his large, rough hands moving with a surgeon's precision as he cleaned the cut. Lila flinched as the hot water stung the raw flesh. "Hold still," he murmured. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. He applied a salve that smelled of pine and herbs and then wrapped her palm in a clean bandage, his movements efficient and sure. When he was done, his hand lingered over hers for a moment, his thumb gently stroking the back of her wrist. The simple, human gesture of comfort was so unexpected it made her throat ache. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his gaze distant, and rose to put the kettle on the fire. They ate a simple meal of dried jerky and hard biscuits, the silence stretching between them. This was their wedding night, a contract, a convenience. And here they were, trapped by a blizzard in a one-room cabin, 1,000,000 miles from the world. Later, as the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the log walls, the storm seemed to isolate them completely, cocooning them in its wild embrace. Lila sat on a stool, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, watching Jonah. He was staring at the small, chipped brass bell on the mantelpiece. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice so quiet she barely heard him. The words were raw, torn from a place of deep, guarded pain. "Emily." She loved the sound it made. "We had it hanging on the porch of our homestead in Kansas. She said it sounded like laughter." Lila held her breath, not daring to speak, knowing this was a sacred confidence, a door opening into the fortress of his grief. "She was 4, he continued, his eyes still fixed on the bell. My wife, Sarah. She was a school teacher. Kindest soul you'd ever meet. When the diphtheria came, it moved so fast. There was nothing the doctor could do. I lost them both in the space of a week. He finally looked at Lila, and the desolation in his eyes was a raw, physical thing. I buried them myself, on the prairie. After that, the world just felt empty, full of ghosts. So I came up here. The mountains are quiet. They don't remember what you've lost. The confession laid him bare. He was not a hermit by choice, but a man in exile, a refugee from a life that had been stolen from him. Lila's own problems, the ranch, the will. Silas. They seemed small and manageable compared to the finality of his loss. "I'm so sorry, Jonah," she said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. To her surprise, he asked, "And you, Miss Ashford, what ghost do you have?" He used her formal name, but the question was intimate. She thought for a moment, the warmth of the fire and his quiet presence making her feel safe enough to share a piece of her own vulnerability. "When I was 10, she began, her voice soft. "I nearly died of typhoid fever. I was sick for weeks. I remember the fever dreams, the feeling of floating away. But mostly, I remember my father. He never left my side. He sat in a chair by my bed, day and night. He read to me, bathed my head with cool water. And when the doctor said I wouldn't make it through the night, my father held my hand and he refused to let go. He just sat there, holding on. And in the morning, the fever broke." She looked at her bandaged hand. "He was a hard man, my father, stubborn and proud. He thought a woman needed a man to protect her. That's why he wrote that will. It was his clumsy way of trying to hold my hand, even after he was gone. He was just afraid to let go." In the firelight, they were no longer a rancher and a mountain man, no longer parties to a contract. They were just two people, marked by loss and fear, finding a moment of fragile connection in the heart of a storm. A flicker of an emotion she couldn't name and dared not examine sparked within her. She was terrified of her pretend husband, not because he was a stranger, but because she was afraid she might wish he wasn't. Jonah stood and added another log to the fire. "You should get some sleep. You can take the bunk." "Where will you sleep?" "Here, by the fire. I'm used to it." Lila lay down on the narrow bunk, pulling the heavy fur blanket over her. She could feel his presence across the room, a steady, watchful warmth. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, there was a profound and unexpected peace. She listened to the soft chime of the little brass bell as a gust of wind found a crack in the door frame, a tiny, hopeful sound in the vast, roaring darkness. A call back to the world of the living. She fell asleep not feeling like a woman who had bought a husband, but like a woman who was, for the first time, truly safe. She woke to silence. The storm had passed. A brilliant, painful light was streaming through the window. The world outside was a sea of unbroken white. Jonah was already awake, standing by the door, staring out. There was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there the night before. "What is it?" she asked. "Sitting up?" He didn't turn. Someone was here. She got up and went to stand beside him. He pointed. In the pristine snow, not 20 yards from the cabin, was a set of tracks, a man on horseback. The tracks weren't wandering, they were deliberate. The rider had circled the cabin, a wide, slow perimeter, before heading back down the mountain. And then Lila saw it, a small, dark object half buried in the snow beneath a pine tree at the edge of the clearing. Jonah walked out, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. He knelt, picked up the object, and walked back to the cabin. He opened his hand. Lying on his palm was a single and spent rifle cartridge, its brass casing gleaming dully in the morning sun. The message was unmistakable. They had been watched all night. Silas wasn't just fighting them with lawyers and injunctions. He had sent a scout, a wolf, to circle their sanctuary. The 72-hour siege had begun, and the enemy was already at their door. The Redwater Saloon had been stripped of its usual character. The poker tables were pushed against the walls, and the bar was draped in a canvas sheet. In their place, rows of benches had been set up, all facing a makeshift judge's bench where Judge Elias Thorne, a man with a face like a tired hawk and a reputation for stern but fair justice, now sat. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, sawdust, and nervous sweat. Nearly the entire town was crammed inside, their faces a gallery of suspicion, curiosity, and grim anticipation. This was not just a legal hearing, it was a public dissection, and Lila and Jonah were the specimens. They sat at a small table to the right, with Sheriff Maeve beside them, looking woefully out of place in her role as legal counsel. Across the room, Silas Carr sat with his weasel-faced lawyer, Mr. Finch, radiating an aura of supreme confidence. "This court is now in session," Judge Thorne announced, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. "We are here to hear the petition of Mr. Silas Carr, who alleges that the recent marriage of Miss Lila Ashford, now Mrs. Lila Pike, is a fraudulent conveyance designed to obstruct the execution of the last will and testament of Mr. Sterling Ashford, Mr. Finch. You may begin." Finch rose, a predatory smirk on his thin lips. "Thank you, Your Honor. The petitioner's case is simple. We intend to prove that this so-called marriage is nothing but a desperate, last-minute business arrangement, a sham designed to defraud my client of his rightful inheritance." He began by calling his first witness a nervous, sweating clerk from the Redwater Hotel named Elias. Under Finch's slick questioning, Elias testified that he had been in the hotel lobby when Mrs. Pike had arrived in town. "And what did you overhear?" son Finch asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Well, sir," Elias stammered, refusing to look at Lila, "I heard her asking about Mr. Pike, asking where to find him. She sounded desperate, said she needed to hire him for a job, and that she would make it worth his while." A ripple of knowing murmurs went through the crowd. Finch let the words hang in the air. Make it worth his while. A curious phrase. Wouldn't you agree, does that sound like the talk of a woman in love? Or a woman looking to purchase a service? Maeve jumped to her feet. "Objection, the lawyer is leading the witness in drawing conclusions." "Sustained," the judge said wearily. "Stick to the facts, Mr. Finch." But the damage was done. Next, Finch turned his attention to Jonah, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Now, let us consider the other party to this arrangement. Mr. Jonah Pike, a man of no fixed address, no known occupation save for trapping, a man who, by his own choice, lives apart from civilized society. What kind of man is he? The kind, I submit, who would be susceptible to a lucrative financial offer." Finch produced a document with a flourish. "This, Your Honor, is a copy of Mr. Pike's military service record. While it notes his service as a scout, it also notes a dishonorable discharge for gross insubordination and conduct unbecoming a soldier." Jonah, who had been sitting as still as stone, visibly flinched. Lila saw his hands clench into fists on the table. The charge was a lie, a vicious twisting of the truth. She knew, instinctively, that there was more to that story, a reason buried in the same past that held his wife and child. But in the cold, hard light of the courtroom, the accusation was damning. He was not a hero. He was a disgraced outcast. Finally, Finch turned his attention to Lila herself. "Mrs. Pike," he began, the name an insult on his tongue. "Is it not true that on the day before your wedding, you withdrew $500 in cash from the Redwater Bank?" Lila's blood ran cold. It was true. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. $500, Finch repeated, letting the sum sink in. In a territory where a ranch hand made $1 a day, it was a fortune, a rather large sum to be carrying around. May I ask what it was for? It was for my ranch hands, Lila said, her voice rising with indignation. It's the end of the season. My father always paid a winter bonus in cash. I was carrying on his tradition. Finch chuckled. A nasty, condescending sound. A bonus? How convenient. A large, untraceable cash payment, made just hours before you suddenly decide to marry a penniless hermit you barely know. Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. This was not a bonus. This was a down payment. The purchase price for a husband. The saloon erupted in a chaotic buzz. People were looking at her differently now, the suspicion hardening into certainty. She was exactly what they'd always thought a cold, calculating rich woman, buying her way out of trouble. Maeve did her best on cross-examination, but it was like trying to punch smoke. Elias the clerk stuck to his story. The military record, though likely misrepresented, was an official document, and Lila's own admission about the cash was a nail in their coffin. They had no witnesses, no evidence to refute the narrative Finch had so skillfully woven. The case was collapsing around them. Judge Thorne looked at them, his expression grim. Mrs. Pike. Sheriff, do you have anything further to present? Lila's heart sank. No, Your Honor, Maeve said, her voice heavy with defeat. In that case, wait. The voice came from the back of the saloon. It was quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone turn. Pushing his way through the crowd was Abel Running Deer. He was a Cheyenne man in his late 50s, his face a noble landscape of deep lines, his long, graying hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He was the town's finest carpenter, a man known for his quiet dignity and unerring honesty. He walked to the front of the room, his dark eyes fixed on the judge. I have something to say, he said, his voice calm and steady. Finch was on his feet instantly. Objection, this man is not on any witness list. This is a preliminary hearing, not a full trial, the judge countered. His interest piqued. I'll allow it. Mr. Running Deer, please approach. Abel stood before the judge, radiating an integrity that made Finch's legal theatrics look cheap and hollow. Your Honor, he began, 2 nights ago, I was in the foothills north of the Ashford Ranch, checking my trap lines before the storm hit. I was on the ridge overlooking the reservoir. A hush fell over the room. I saw men down by the dam, Abel continued. 3 of them. They weren't ranch hands. They were carrying survey equipment. I recognized them. They were part of the crew marking the new route for Mr. Carr's railroad. Silas Carr went rigid, his face turning a shade paler. It was dark, but there was a moon. I saw them place a charge against the dam wall. I saw them light a fuse and run. Then, the explosion. Abel's voice was even, factual, carrying the simple, unshakable power of the truth. Finch forced a laugh. Your Honor, this is absurd. A fantastical story from a man who was likely trespassing on private property? Abel ignored him. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and placed a small object on the judge's bench. It was a piece of hardwood, expertly carved into the shape of a wedge. Burned into its side was a small, distinct symbol, a C entwined with a railroad spike. When the sun came up yesterday, I went down to the broken dam. Abel said, I found this. It's a specialized chalk wedge, the kind used to level surveying transits on uneven ground. That mark, it's the mark of Silas Carr's Union Rail survey crew. They left it behind. The saloon was utterly silent. The piece of wood sat on the judge's bench, a small, irrefutable witness. It was no longer Abel's word against Silas's. It was hard evidence. But the seed of doubt, so carefully planted by Finch, had taken root. The jury of townspeople looked from the stoic Cheyenne carpenter to the powerful white railroad tycoon. They were caught between the truth they had just heard and a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. A man like Abel was an outsider. A man like Silas, for all his faults, was a man of their world, a man of progress and money. Judge Thorne stared at the wooden wedge for a long time, his fingers steepled before him. He could feel the tension in the room, the deep, ugly currents of race and class. "The evidence presented by Mr. Running Deer is compelling," he said finally, his voice heavy. "However, it raises serious new questions that are outside the scope of this initial hearing. This court is adjourned for 24 hours to allow the sheriff time to investigate these new claims. We will reconvene at the same time tomorrow." He struck his gavel, and the hearing was over. It was not a victory, but a reprieve. They had been thrown a lifeline, but they were still drowning. That night, a different kind of alarm sounded. Not a gavel, but the frantic, terrifying clang of the church bell, ringing out the signal for a fire. Lila and Jonah rushed out of the small room they had rented at the hotel. A hellish orange glow was painting the night sky, coming from the direction of the Ashford Ranch. The main barn, Lila cried, her voice choked with horror. They ran, joining the stream of townspeople heading out of town, their legal battle forgotten in the face of a more immediate disaster. When they arrived, the scene was one of chaos. The huge hay barn, the heart of the ranch's winter operations, was an inferno. Flames leaped 50 feet into the air, and the roar was deafening. Her ranch hands, joined by men from town, were forming a desperate bucket brigade from the well, a futile effort against the raging blaze. Lila's eyes darted to the adjacent structure, a smaller, stoutly built barn. The horses, she breathed, her blood running cold. The breeding stock is in there. Her prize mares, the future of her entire herd. The wind was driving the flames directly toward it. Embers were already landing on its roof. "We have to get them out," she screamed. Jonah didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 wet blankets from a trough. "Cover your face," he yelled, throwing one to her. They ran toward the horse barn, the heat so intense it felt like a physical blow. Inside, the horses were screaming in terror, their eyes wide and white, crashing against the sides of their stalls. The barn was thick with smoke, and the sound of the approaching fire was a deafening roar. Working as a team, driven by pure adrenaline, they unlatched the stalls, slapping and shouting at the terrified animals, driving them out the far door into the relative safety of an open pasture. One by one, they got the mares out, until only one was left, a young filly, trapped in a corner stall, too frightened to move. "I'll get her," Lila shouted, starting toward the stall. Suddenly, a terrifying cracking sound came from above. A huge roof beam, eaten through by the fire from the main barn, was beginning to give way. "Lila, get out!" Now, Jonah roared, grabbing her arm and physically pulling her toward the door. They stumbled out into the night just as the beam crashed down in a shower of sparks and flame. Exactly where Lila had been standing, they stood, gasping for air, watching the horse barn begin to succumb to the inferno. And then they heard the cry, "Help me, I'm stuck." Lila's head whipped around. Finn O'Connell, the young ranch hand, was trapped. In the chaos of freeing the horses, he had been knocked down near the entrance, and the fallen, burning beam was blocking his only exit. Flames were all around him. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, Jonah turned and plunged back into the burning building. Lila screamed his name. The crowd gasped. A collective sound of horror. He disappeared into the smoke and flame. For an agonizing 10 seconds that felt like a lifetime, there was nothing. Then he emerged, a figure from a nightmare, his coat smoking. He was half carrying, half dragging the coughing, soot-covered form of Finn. He got the boy clear and collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Finn was safe, terrified, but alive. Jonah pushed himself to his feet. The sleeve of his left arm was burned away, his skin beneath a raw, angry red. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on Lila, a question in their smoky depths, asterisk. "Are you all right, asterisk?" She ran to him, her heart in her throat. The townspeople, who had been watching, frozen in horror, now surged forward. They were no longer suspicious onlookers. They were neighbors. They looked at the burning ruin of her barn, at the saved horses, at the terrified boy, and then at Jonah, standing solid and protective beside her. His arm burned from saving one of her own. In the flickering, hellish light of the fire, they no longer saw a fraudulent contract. They saw a husband and a wife fighting for their home. They saw a man who had just walked through fire for another, and the tide of opinion, far more powerful than any judge's ruling, began to turn. The fire at the Ashford barn did more than just consume hay and timber. It burned away the last of the town's skepticism. In the gray, smoke-choked light of the following day, the people of Redwater looked at Lila and Jonah not as a spectacle, but as their own. Men who had whispered gossip behind their hands now offered to help clear the debris. Women who had eyed Lila with envy now brought coffee and blankets. Abel Running Deer's testimony, followed by Jonah's selfless act, had tipped the scales of public opinion. They had a fighting chance. Their proof lay in a thick, leather-bound book, Sterling Ashford's original ranch ledger. It was a meticulous record of every transaction, every wage, every bonus paid for the last 20 years. The entry for the $500 was there, clearly marked seasonal bonus, consistent with a decade of identical entries. It was the one piece of evidence that could shred Finch's narrative of a purchased husband. With Judge Thorne set to reconvene court in the afternoon, Lila and Jonah knew they had to get the ledger from the ranch safe and present it themselves. Sheriff Maeve advised against it. Silas knows you'll be going for it. He's a cornered rat now, and that's when they're most dangerous. Let me send a deputy. With all due respect, Sheriff, Jonah said, his burned arm now cleaned and tightly bandaged. Your deputies are good men, but they're not scouts. Silas won't send someone who will be seen. We'll go ourselves. We know the land. There was no arguing with the quiet finality in his voice. They rode out of Redwater under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, taking a less traveled route through the broken foothills. The ledger was wrapped in oilskin and secured in Jonah's saddlebag. The air was cold and still, the silence unnerving. Every rock formation, every stand of juniper, seemed to hold a potential threat. They entered a narrow chasm known locally as Blood Draw Canyon, a jagged wound in the earth carved by millennia of flash floods. Its steep, shale-covered walls rose 100 feet on either side, blocking out the sky and amplifying every sound: the clink of a horseshoe on stone, the creak of saddle leather. "We're exposed here," Lila said, her voice a low murmur. Her hand rested on the grip of the Colt revolver holstered at her hip, a gift from her father she had practiced with but never had cause to draw. "I know," Jonah replied, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim above. "It's the fastest way back. Stay close." They were halfway through when the first shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at them. The bullet struck the canyon wall a dozen feet ahead, whining off the rock and exploding into a spray of shale fragments. It was a warning, a command to halt. Jonah reacted instantly. "Off the horses now," he yelled, swinging out of his saddle and pulling his rifle free in one fluid motion. Lila followed suit, her heart hammering against her ribs as she scrambled for the cover of a cluster of massive boulders. High above them, on both rims of the canyon, figures appeared, at least 5 of them. They were silhouetted against the gray sky, armed and ready. They were trapped. Pike, a voice echoed down the canyon walls. "Throw down the ledger and your guns, and we might just let the lady ride out of here." Jonah didn't answer. He pressed himself against the rock, his breathing steady, his eyes calculating. He was reading the terrain, the wind, the placement of his enemies. He was not a rancher. He was a soldier on a battlefield of his own choosing. "Stay here," he said to Lila. "Don't fire unless they get past me." "They'll kill you," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They'll try," he said, a grim line where a smile should have been. He slipped away, moving from boulder to boulder with a silent, preternatural grace that made him seem a part of the stone itself. A second shot rang out, closer this time, kicking up dirt near Lila's feet. Her fear gave way to a hot surge of anger. She drew her revolver, the checkered grip feeling solid and real in her trembling hand. She steadied her arm on the boulder, just as her father had taught her, and aimed at the dark shape on the ridge. Before she could fire, Jonah's rifle cracked, the sound a sharp, clean clap that was utterly distinct from the enemy's guns. He hadn't fired at a man, he had fired at the rock face just below one of the ambushers. The bullet ricocheted upwards with a high-pitched scream, and the man yelped and scrambled back from the ledge. It was a shot of impossible skill, a display of lethal control. Another of Silas's men opened fire, a volley of shots that hammered against the boulders, sending stone chips flying. Under the cover of the noise, Jonah moved again. Lila lost sight of him. Panic seized her for a moment, and then she saw him, 50 yards up the canyon, in a new position that gave him an angle on the other side of the ridge. His rifle spoke again, and again. He was not aiming to kill. He was a master of psychological warfare. A shot would hit a canteen, sending water spraying. Another would hit the stock of a rifle, splintering the wood. He was dismantling them piece by piece, sowing terror and confusion without shedding a drop of blood. He was showing them that he could kill them at any moment, and that their lives depended entirely on his restraint. Enraged and frustrated, 2 of the men on the rim started firing wildly down into the canyon, their bullets pinging and screaming off the rocks. The deafening echoes hammered against the canyon walls, a relentless percussion of violence. And then the canyon answered. It began with a low rumble, a deep, guttural vibration that Lila felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. The ground trembled. High above, the shale wall, loosened by the recent storm and shaken by the concussive force of the gunshots, began to give way. A river of rock and mud and debris cascaded down the steep incline, a terrifying avalanche that moved with impossible speed. Jonah Lila screamed, her warning swallowed by the roar. The rock slide crashed down right where Jonah had been positioned. He turned, his eyes wide, but there was no time to run. He was engulfed, buried in a churning tide of earth and stone. For a moment, the world stopped. The shooting stopped. All Lila could hear was the settling of the rocks and the roaring in her own ears. "No," she breathed, the word a prayer. She scrambled out from behind her cover, clawing her way over the fresh slide, shouting his name. Then she saw a hand, his hand, reaching up from the mud and debris. He was alive. She dug frantically, her bare hands tearing at the loose rock and wet earth until he could pull himself free. He was covered in mud, his face bleeding from a dozen small cuts, his left arm, the burned one, hanging at an odd angle. He staggered to his feet, leaning on her heavily. They clung to each other in the sudden, eerie silence, shaking, not just from the cold of the mud and snow, but from the raw, visceral terror of the moment. His arms were wrapped around her, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. They were alive, together, in the heart of the mud and the blood and the fear. "I thought you were gone," she whispered into his chest. "Not yet," he rasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment was shattered by the crunch of boots on shale. The leader of the ambushers was coming down from the rim, his rifle leveled. He was a big, hard-faced man with a thick mustache and the cold eyes of a killer. Jonah pushed Lila behind him, shielding her with his body. He had lost his rifle in the slide. All he had was the pistol tucked in his belt. It was 1 man against 3, and he was injured. The big man walked toward them, his men fanning out behind him. He stopped 10 feet away, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. "Well, Pike, looks like your luck just ran out. Give me the ledger." Jonah didn't move. He simply stared at the man, a strange, dawning recognition in his eyes. He looked past the hard face, past the years of violence, and saw a ghost. Clay Jonah's voice was a choked whisper. "Clay Murdoch." The big man's smile vanished. His face went slack with shock. The rifle in his hands wavered. "Jonah! My God! Is that you?" The other gunman looked on, confused. "What happened to you?" Clay Jonah asked, his voice filled with a decade of pain and loss. "We served together. We bled together. Now you're working for scum like Silas Carr." Clay Murdoch looked away, a deep shame flooding his features. He lowered his rifle. "He paid, Jonah. He paid double. Said to get the ledger. Said to make sure you two didn't make it to the hearing." He looked at Lila, then back at Jonah, standing there, battered but unbroken, protecting his wife. "I left the army after everything. Bounced around. A gun's a gun. The pay was good. I didn't know it was you." "It's never too late to be the man you were supposed to be," Jonah said, his voice quiet but intense. Clay stood there, a man caught between two worlds, the mercenary he had become and the soldier he once was. He looked at his men, then back at the unyielding figure of his old friend. With a deep sigh, he made his choice. He turned to his men. "It's over. Lower your weapons." Then he looked at Jonah, his face a mask of regret. "He'll kill me for this." "Or you can help me stop him," Jonah countered. "Testify. Tell the judge who hired you. Who blew the dam? Who set the fire?" Clay Murdoch looked at his hands, then at Jonah. He gave a slow, weary nod. "All right, Jonah, I'll do it." He retrieved the ledger from Jonah's saddlebag, its oilskin cover caked in mud, and handed it to him. Then his face grew urgent. "But you need to listen to me. This hearing, it's a sideshow, a diversion to keep everyone busy." "What are you talking about?" Lila asked, stepping out from behind Jonah. "Carr doesn't need to win in court," Clay said, his words coming in a rush. "The dam, the fire. He created a crisis. He's using his railroad's charter to petition the Territorial Land Office. He's claiming that due to the instability and mismanagement of the Ashford property, his railroad needs to invoke its emergency powers to seize control of the water rights to protect the territory's infrastructure." Lila's blood ran cold. It was a brilliant, diabolical plan. He was circumventing the will, the court, everything. He was using the very disasters he had created as justification for illegal theft on a massive scale. When Jonah demanded, Clay looked toward the east, where the sky was just beginning to show the faintest hint of gray. "The territorial clerk is a drunk. Carr's got him lined up. He's signing the papers at his desk in the land office. At dawn." Dawn was less than an hour away. The legal battle they thought they were fighting was a ghost. The real war was happening right now, in a quiet office in Redwater, and they were about to lose it all. There was no time for deliberation, no time for tending to wounds. Dawn was a blade hanging over their heads, with Clay Murdoch's words echoing in the frozen air of the canyon. A frantic, desperate energy seized them. They scrambled to their horses, Jonah moving with a pained stiffness, his injured arm a liability he refused to acknowledge, as Lila prepared to mount. Her eyes fell on the small leather pouch on Jonah's saddle, the one from which he had produced her wedding ring. On impulse, driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she reached for another pouch, the one containing the small, chipped brass bell she had taken from his mantelpiece for safekeeping. She tucked it deep into the pocket of her coat. It was a piece of him, a piece of his lost world, and in that desperate moment, it felt like the only sacred thing she had. The ride back to Redwater was a desperate, punishing race against the coming light. They pushed their horses recklessly through the darkness, Clay Murdoch riding with them, a man transformed from predator to reluctant ally. The pounding of hooves was a frantic heartbeat against the silent earth. Lila rode beside Jonah, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a small, recurring point of contact in the chaotic rush. She could see the pain etched on his face in the faint moonlight, but his jaw was set like granite. He was no longer just protecting her. He was fighting for a foothold in a world he had long since turned his back on. They thundered into Redwater as the first anemic hint of dawn bled across the eastern horizon. The town was asleep, a collection of dark, silent shapes, but a single light burned in the window of the Territorial Land and Title Office at the end of Main Street. They dismounted, their horses heaving for breath, and ran, their boots pounding on the wooden boardwalk. Jonah kicked the door open without ceremony. The scene inside was exactly as Clay had described. Silas Carr stood over a rickety desk, his face flushed with triumph. Before him sat a portly, bleary-eyed man, Mr. Peabody, the territorial clerk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. A stack of official-looking documents lay on the desk, and Peabody had a pen dipped in ink, poised just above the signature line. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas snarled, spinning around, his face contorting in rage as he saw them. The meaning: Mr. Carr. Sheriff Maeve Doolan's voice cut through the tension as she appeared in the doorway behind them, her shotgun held loosely but readily. "Is that you're conducting official business in the middle of the night with a public servant who is clearly intoxicated? That's a crime in this territory." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool. Maeve, this is perfectly legal. The railroad's emergency charter gives me the right, the obligation to secure vital resources in times of crisis, and thanks to my dear cousin's incompetence, this valley is in crisis." He gestured to the clerk. "Sign it, Peabody." Peabody, his hand trembling, looked from Silas's furious face to the barrel of Maeve's shotgun. He was trapped. The documents seemed to be in order. "Sheriff." The law was a tangled web, and Silas had woven his strand perfectly. For a moment, it seemed he would win. They had the truth, but he had the paperwork. It was then that Lila knew what she had to do. She backed out of the office, her hand closing around the cold, solid shape of the brass bell in her pocket. She walked to the center of the town square, a lonely figure in the vast, pre-dawn emptiness. She took a deep breath, and with all her strength, she began to shake the bell. It did not make a grand, booming sound like the church bell. It was a small, frantic, surprisingly piercing chime, a sound that cut through the cold air with an urgent, personal plea. It was not a summons. It was an alarm. The sound of a world being broken. Emily's bell. The bell that sounded like laughter, now ringing out a warning in the dark. One by one, lights appeared in windows. Doors creaked open. People emerged, pulling on coats and wrapping blankets around their shoulders, drawn by the strange, insistent sound. They saw Lila Ashford, standing alone in the square, ringing a tiny bell as if her life depended on it. They saw the tense standoff at the land office. They gathered, a silent, watchful crowd, their faces pale in the lantern light. The public square had become the courtroom. Judge Thorne arrived, hastily dressed, his face a thundercloud of judicial fury at being awoken. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded. Silas stepped out onto the porch of the land office, attempting to project an air of authority. "This is a simple administrative matter, Your Honor, being obstructed by this hysterical woman and her hired thug." "That's a lie." The words came from Clay Murdoch, who stepped forward into the lantern light, his face grim. Every eye in the crowd turned to him, recognizing him as the leader of the hired guns. "My name is Clay Murdoch. Mr. Carr hired me and my men. He paid us to blow the Ashford Dam. He paid us to set the barn fire, and he paid us to stop Jonah and Lila Pike from reaching your courtroom yesterday." He pulled a folded, crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "This is a letter, in his own hand, detailing our last payment and instructing us to resolve the matter permanently." He handed it to Judge Thorne. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas's face turned the color of ash. "This is an outrage, the ravings of a common criminal trying to save his own skin." "Is it a small, trembling voice asked?" A young woman pushed her way to the front of the crowd. It was Minnie Clark, the junior clerk from the bank. A girl so timid she barely spoke above a whisper. She clutched a thin ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. I work at the bank." "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Mr. Carr made me handle his private accounts. He told me it was for railroad expenses. But the money went to men like Mr. Murdoch. He kept a separate ledger for the cash payments, a scratchbook. He thought I burned it, but I couldn't. It wasn't right. With trembling hands, she handed the scratchbook to the judge. It was the final piece, the undeniable proof of Silas's network of corruption. Cornered, exposed, and ruined. Silas finally broke. He lunged not at Clay or Minnie, but at the very foundation of their alliance. His voice a venomous shriek. "You'll listen to them, to a hired gun and a sniveling girl. This whole thing is a farce, built on a fraudulent marriage. Ask her," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Lila. "Ask her what she offered him. Ask her about their one-day deal." The crowd went silent. All eyes turned to Lila. This was the final test. She could deny it, lie, and perhaps save face, but she was done with lies. She looked at the faces of the townspeople at Maeve, at Abel Running Deer, at Ruth Navarro and Reverend Ward, who had joined the crowd. She looked at their tired, questioning faces. And then she looked at Jonah. He stood beside her, battered and bleeding, his gaze steady on hers, offering not a command or an expectation, but a quiet, unwavering trust. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice ringing out in the cold. "Clear air. He's telling the truth." A shocked murmur rippled through the square. "It's true that I went up that mountain looking for a contract, not a husband," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I was afraid, and I saw Mr. Pike as a means to an end. I thought all I needed was to borrow his name for a single day to save my ranch." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before returning to Jonah. "But I was wrong. I thought I was fighting for land and silver. I didn't realize I was fighting for this, for a community that comes together in the face of a fire, for the courage of a good man who speaks the truth when it's hard, for the quiet integrity of a man who would walk through fire and face down guns. Not for a contract, but because it was the right thing to do. I thought I only needed a day, but this mountain and its people have taught me that a lifetime is what's worth fighting for." The silence that followed was profound. It was a confession, a testament, and a declaration all in one. It was Jonah who broke it. He took a step forward, his injured arm held carefully at his side, and addressed the judge. His voice was rough, but it held a new resonance, a new connection to the world around him. "Your Honor," he began, "when I married this woman, I made a promise to act as her husband and protect her. The annulment she mentioned, the one-day deal, that was her idea, not mine." He turned and looked directly at Lila, and for the first time, she saw the walls around his heart crumble completely, revealing the deep, aching vulnerability beneath. "I spent years running from commitment, from ever feeling anything for anyone again. I thought I wanted to be left alone. But this woman, she rode up my mountain and dragged me back into the world, and I find I don't want to leave." He turned back to the judge. "I ask the court to deny any petition for annulment, postpone it, indefinitely. Give me the chance, Your Honor. Give me the chance to learn how to stay." A slow smile spread across Lila's face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy that lit her from within. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked at the man who was truly, in his soul, her husband. "I'm already staying," she said softly, a promise meant only for him. Maeve Doolin stepped forward, the iron cuffs in her hand. "Silas Carr, you're under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder." As Maeve snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, Silas glared at Jonah and Lila, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "The railroad has a long memory. You've made an enemy you can't even comprehend." He was led away. As the crowd began to break up, their hushed conversations creating a new, hopeful buzz in the rising dawn. Lila noticed a man standing at the edge of the square. He was dressed in a long city coat and held a small notebook. He hadn't said a word, but he had watched everything, his pen scratching furiously. a reporter from the Cheyenne Daily Leader, *. The story of Redwater's stand was about to travel far beyond the Bighorn Mountains. Spring came to the Bighorns not as a gentle guest, but as a powerful, life-giving flood. The snows melted in a great rush, and the creeks, once thin and thirsty, now roared with cold, clear water. The red dust of autumn was gone, replaced by a carpet of green so vibrant it hurt the eyes. In the valley, the air was sweet with the scent of wet earth and wild hyacinth. The reopening of the Ashford Canal was a town holiday. There was no official declaration, but everyone in Redwater seemed to find a reason to be there. Abel Running Deer, who had been awarded the contract to rebuild the dam with town funds, supervised the final placement of the new headgate. His work was, as always, flawless, a testament to skill and patience. When he gave the signal, a group of ranchers, including men who had once looked at Lila's water with envy, worked together to heave the gate open. A cheer went up as the water, brown and rich with mountain soil, surged into the long dry channel, a liquid lifeline racing toward the parched pastures. Lila stood beside Jonah, watching the water flow, and felt a profound sense of peace. The ranch hands she'd hired to help with the rebuilding, some of them former Union railmen, left jobless after Silas's disgrace, let out a whoop of their own. They were no longer outsiders. They were part of the ranch. Their sweat and labor now mingled with the water and the land. Redwater itself was healing, growing. The schoolhouse had a new wing, the lumber supplied by Abel's crew. Inside, Ruth Navarro taught an ever-growing class of children, while the town's finances, including the school's budget, were managed with meticulous care by Minnie Clark. The timid bank clerk had found her voice and her spine, and was now a respected member of the town council, her sharp mind for numbers ensuring that every penny of the town's money was accounted for. The story of their stand, immortalized in a surprisingly poetic front-page article in the Cheyenne Daily Leader titled "The Conscience of a Community," had brought a different kind of attention to the small town. Redwater was no longer a dusty backwater, but a symbol of frontier justice, a place where ordinary people had refused to bend to the iron will of money and power. Silas Carr's trial was a swift affair. Faced with Clay Murdoch's testimony, Minnie Clark's ledger, and a signed confession from the drunken territorial clerk, he was convicted of bribery, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. The railroad, eager to distance itself from the scandal, cut all ties, leaving him to face justice alone. His last threat about the railroad's long memory proved as empty as his character. Clay Murdoch, true to his word, had testified. The judge, taking his cooperation and Jonah's personal appeal for leniency into account, had given him a reduced sentence of 2 years hard labor, to be served on a state prison farm. He had accepted his fate with a quiet dignity, shaking Jonah's hand before he was led away, a man finally on the long road to redeeming his own honor. But the greatest change was happening on a gentle slope overlooking the newly flowing creek. There, Jonah was building their home. It was not the grand mansion of Ashford lore, nor was it the isolated one-room fortress on the mountain. It was something in between, built of sturdy pine from the high country and stone from the creek bed. It was a house with wide windows that let in the light, and a deep porch that invited the world to sit for a while. It was the house of a man who was no longer hiding. One bright, windy afternoon, when the last of the roof beams was in place, Lila came out to see Jonah standing on a ladder by the front door. He was carefully hanging something from a hook he had just installed. It was the small, chipped brass bell from his cabin. It looked small and humble against the new wood of the porch. As the wind swept down the valley, it stirred the bell, which let out its faint, clear chime. It was no longer a sound of lonely memory, but a sound of welcome, a reminder not of what was lost, but of the choice to return to the world, to the people who made it a home. That evening, they sat on the unfinished porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The air was cool, and Jonah draped a blanket over her shoulders. A letter had arrived that afternoon from Reverend Ezekiel Ward. Lila opened it and read it aloud in the fading light. It was not a long letter. The Reverend wrote that in all his years, he had never witnessed a union blessed with more trial and tribulation, nor one that had proved itself more true. He considered the hurried, legal ceremony in the sheriff's office to be merely the planting of a seed in hard ground. What they had done since the trust, the sacrifice, the public declarations that was the true marriage. He had enclosed a small, hand-calligraphed certificate, backdated to that day, but this time it was not a legal document, it was a blessing. He had taken the liberty, he wrote, of amending the vows to reflect their journey, changing the standard text to a simple, powerful phrase asterisk to have and to hold, and to choose to stay, from this day forward. When she finished reading, Lila folded the letter, her hands trembling slightly. A comfortable, profound silence settled between them, filled with all the things that no longer needed to be said. Jonah reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He traced the line of her knuckles with his thumb, a simple, grounding gesture. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. He was right, she said softly. The real ceremony wasn't in Maeve's office. No, Jonah agreed, his voice a low rumble in his chest. I think it was in the fire, and in the canyon. He turned his head, his bearded cheek brushing against her hair. She looked up at him. In the starlight, the guarded, haunted look was gone from his eyes. In its place was a deep, quiet contentment she had never seen before. He was a man who had finally come home. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, and their lips met. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding peace. A kiss of arrival. It was a promise, sealed in the quiet of a Wyoming night, that justice was a long road, but love was the steady, patient water that made the journey worthwhile. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.